The scent of gardenias and the amber light spilling through the windows of the Grand Pavilion, the most sought-after event space in New York City, were the natural habitat of Victoria Hayes. At 42, she wasn't just a successful entrepreneur. She was an architect of dreams, a conductor who orchestrated the complex symphony of weddings, celebrations, and corporate milestones with a calm that bordered on the supernatural. Her company, Elite Events, was the seal of excellence that turned any occasion into an indelible memory. Victoria had built her empire with grit, determination, and an infallible intuition for beauty and logistics. Every detail, from the weight of the invitation paper to the exact angle of a table arrangement, passed through her scrutiny. And it was this dedication that placed her on a pedestal where competitors could barely glimpse her. However, the stage for her most recent challenge wasn't a ballroom, but the dining room of her own home, where the tension could be cut with the same silver cake server that would slice a wedding cake. Her husband Alexander's family was gathered. The occasion was the engagement celebration of Ben, Alexander's younger brother, to Madison, a sweet young woman with dreamy eyes. The initial joy, however, quickly dissolved into a fog of financial worry that hung over the table like a storm cloud. Ben, a talented graphic designer, and Madison, a newly graduated teacher, had a love straight out of a fairy tale, but a budget that could barely cover reality. The conversation revolved around numbers that sounded like sentences. $100,000. That was the estimated cost for the wedding they envisioned, a figure that, for their reality, was as reachable as touching the moon. Alexander's mother, Patricia, a woman of dramatic gestures and audible sighs, lamented with her hand on her chest. "My son deserves the best, but how? With rent, bills? Madison deserves a princess day, not some improvised ceremony in the community hall." Victoria listened in silence, observing the familiar dance of distress. She saw the sparkle in Madison's eyes dim with each suggestion of cuts, a simpler buffet, an amateur photographer, a rented second-hand dress. She saw Ben's dignity fade as he tried to defend the idea of a small and charming wedding, a euphemism for what the money can afford. Alexander, her husband of 15 years, participated in the conversation with performative solidarity, offering solutions he knew were band-aids. He glanced at Victoria occasionally with a look she knew well, the silent expectation that she, the event wizard, would perform a modest miracle, perhaps a discount here, a contact there. He never, in all those years, seemed to grasp the true scale of the empire she commanded. To him and his family, Elite Events was just Victoria's business, a sophisticated hobby that paid for luxuries, but whose inner workings they never bothered to understand. While they debated spreadsheets and sacrifices, Victoria's mind was already operating at high speed, like a supercomputer calculating the variables of a complex problem. 100,000 was the market price, the value for the average client. But she wasn't an average client. She was the queen of that board. In her mind, she was already dialing Michael from the Taste and Elegance Catering, a long-time partner whose loyalty she had cultivated with advantageous contracts and prompt payments. She already envisioned the conversation with Elena from Bloom Designs Decor, who owed her a favor since Victoria saved her daughter's event from disaster. The photographer, the DJ, the venue, all were pieces in an ecosystem she didn't just inhabit, but ruled. She knew exactly which strings to pull, which barter deals to reactivate, which courtesies to request in the name of a solid partnership. The figure that scared the family was, for her, modeling clay. That same evening, after the guests had left, leaving behind an atmosphere of frustrated dreams, Victoria locked herself in her office. The space, decorated with industry awards and photos of spectacular events, was her sanctuary. With her phone in hand, she began her silent orchestration. She called Michael. "Michael, darling, I need a miracle for my brother-in-law's wedding. Think of your best cost price, the one you only do for me." The response was immediate and warm. She called Elena. "Eleanor, remember that deal we had? Time to call it in the form of flowers." One by one, the calls were made. Barters for mentions at future events, discounts in exchange for exclusivity on bigger contracts, courtesies in the name of friendship and the professional respect she inspired. In less than 3 hours, the magic was done. The $100,000 budget plummeted to $40,000, a value still considerable for the young couple, but now within the realm of the possible. However, looking at the final number on her tablet screen, Victoria felt something more. She saw Madison's face, the hope nearly extinguished in her eyes. She remembered Ben's genuine gratitude when she gave him career advice years ago. They were family. And what was $40,000 to her? The profit from a single mid-sized corporate event, less than she spent on her last trip to Milan for a design fair. At that moment, a decision solidified in her heart, born of pure generosity. She wouldn't just make the dream viable, she would gift it. The next day she approached her mother-in-law, Patricia, and said with the discretion the act required, "I managed to sort out the wedding issue. The total came to $40,000, and I'll cover it all. It's my gift to them. I only ask one thing, that my name not be mentioned. Say you got a sponsorship, an angel investor, anything. Their joy is my only payment." Patricia, between tears and awkward hugs, promised to keep the secret. The news spread through the family like a balm. Ben and Madison, euphoric, believed the story of an anonymous investor, moved by their love story. The following weeks were a whirlwind of preparations. Suppliers, instructed by Victoria to maintain the facade, confirmed every detail of a wedding that promised to be memorable. Michael's catering would prepare a menu fit for kings. Elena's flowers would transform the hall into an enchanted garden. Everything proceeded with the perfection of a well-written script, a script Victoria had written and funded from the shadows, content in her role as an anonymous fairy godmother. She felt fulfilled, happy to use her power and influence to create happiness. Little did she know that, behind the scenes of that fairy tale, a dark drama, a betrayal of overwhelming proportions, was being meticulously rehearsed, and the stage for this humiliation would be the very dream she had made possible. The blow would come from the person she least expected, and the wound that would open would be much deeper than any financial problem. The serenity Victoria felt watching Ben and Madison's dream take shape was like the calm before the storm. She moved through the following days with the discreet satisfaction of someone who knows they've done good without needing applause. She followed the preparations from afar, smiling at Madison's enthusiastic reports about the catering tasting or the music choices. For Victoria, their happiness was confirmation that her decision had been right. She allowed herself to relax, believing her good deed was safe, protected by the anonymity she had imposed. However, the tranquility was brutally shattered on a rainy Tuesday, a grey day that would become ground zero for her disillusionment. The call didn't come from a supplier or her mother-in-law, but from Alexander's phone summoning her for a serious talk in his home office, a space he rarely used and that, in that moment, seemed to acquire the cold solemnity of a courtroom. Alexander didn't look her in the eyes when she entered. He was standing by the window watching the rain lash the glass, a posture she had learned to associate with bad news. His voice, when he finally spoke, was devoid of any warmth, loaded with a tone of command he normally reserved for his subordinates at the import company he inherited from his father. "Victoria, about Ben's wedding. There's been a change of plans, and I need you to understand and mainly not cause problems." The phrase, "not cause problems," was the first needle, thin and icy, piercing Victoria's skin. She sat in the leather armchair, her body suddenly tense, and waited. What followed wasn't a request, but a unilateral communication, a sentence pronounced without right to defense. Alexander, with calculated coldness, explained that she could no longer attend the wedding. Her name would be removed from the guest list. The silence that settled in the office was so dense that Victoria could hear the hum of her own incredulity. She blinked, trying to process the information. Excluded from the wedding that she and only she had made possible. Logic refused to accept the absurdity of the situation. "Excluded," she repeated, her voice a thread. "Alexander, what kind of joke is this? I'm your wife. Ben is my brother-in-law." His expression hardened, patience slipping away like sand through fingers. "It's not a joke. It's a decision. A family decision to avoid embarrassments." The word embarrassments hit her like a punch. What embarrassment could her presence cause? She, who had always been the embodiment of discretion and elegance, who moved with the grace of a diplomat at all family events, even when her mother-in-law's veiled criticisms hung in the air. She demanded an explanation, and the truth, when it came, was more sordid and humiliating than anything her mind could have conceived. Alexander wanted to be a groomsman, but not by her side. He wanted to pair with Harper, Madison's recently divorced cousin, an exuberant woman visibly interested in him, who had been exchanging glances and messages with her husband for months, something Victoria, in her blind trust, had chosen to ignore. The family, according to him, had agreed that Victoria's presence as the official wife would create a delicate situation. Her presence would inhibit the new dynamic Alexander wanted to establish. He wasn't just asking a favor. He was announcing the start of an affair, using his brother's wedding as the stage for its social debut with another woman. And the cruelest part, he expected Victoria, the betrayed wife, to withdraw quietly so as not to disrupt the show. The pain of marital betrayal was acute, but it was the next layer of humiliation that took her breath away. He was using the event she funded as the backdrop for his adultery. He was erasing her from her own act of generosity. The anonymity she had requested out of nobility was now used as a weapon against her. Since no one knew she was the benefactor, her absence would be easily justified, perhaps as a last-minute business trip, a sudden illness. No one would question. No one would defend her. She would simply be erased. The woman whose power and influence were the backbone of that event would be treated as a disposable extra. The magnitude of the cruelty left her paralyzed. It was a meticulous plan, a calculated stab meant to hurt not just her heart as a wife, but her soul as a woman, her pride as a professional. So, the whole family knows about this. Ben? Madison? Your mother? She managed to ask, her voice trembling with a cold rage that began to replace the shock. Alexander shrugged, a gesture of indifference more violent than a shout. They want the best for Ben, and the best is a wedding without drama. They agreed this is the simplest solution. The simplest solution. Erase 15 years of marriage, erase the woman who built an empire by his side, erase the benefactor who gave them a dream as a gift. All that was the simplest solution. In that instant, something inside Victoria broke. It wasn't a snap, but a slow, deep fracture. The image of the man she loved or thought she loved crumbled to dust, revealing a selfish and cruel stranger. The pain was immense, but beneath it a new strength began to emerge, forged in the fire of that humiliation. It was the strength of the woman who built elite events from nothing, the woman who negotiated with sharks in the market and won, the woman they had underestimated so spectacularly. She stood up, her posture straight, chin raised, her eyes, now dry, fixed on Alexander's with an intensity that made him step back. There were no more tears, just the cutting clarity of someone seeing the battlefield for the first time. She said nothing. She just turned and walked out of the office, leaving him in uncomfortable silence. He probably interpreted her silence as submission, as the acceptance of a defeated woman. He couldn't have been more wrong. As she walked down the hallway of her home, which suddenly felt like enemy territory, Victoria wasn't thinking of revenge. She was thinking of consequences. They had made a choice. They had excluded her. Now she would show them the true cost of her absence. The phone, which had once been her instrument of generosity, would now be her weapon of justice. The fairy godmother was dead, and in her place, the queen was about to reclaim her throne and her kingdom. The woman who left Alexander's office wasn't the same one who had entered minutes before. The pain of betrayal, sharp and piercing, didn't paralyze her. On the contrary, it acted as a catalyst, burning away the fog of complacency that had settled over 15 years of a comfortable but unequal marriage. The Victoria who now headed to her own sanctuary, the elite events office upstairs, was Victoria in her purest form. The strategist, the negotiator, the woman who understood power, contracts, and above all, consequences. The wound in her heart bled, but her mind was clearer and sharper than ever. She didn't shed a single tear. Tears were for lamented pain. The anger she felt was a pain that transformed into action. She sat in her Italian leather chair, the same one from which she had orchestrated the miracle, and looked out at New York City stretching beyond the panoramic window, the city she had conquered. And her husband's family, in their provincial arrogance, thought they could simply discard her from an event built on the pillars of her own empire. Her first act wasn't impulsive. It was surgical. She picked up her cell phone, the device containing the most powerful contacts in the country's event industry, and her mental agenda, where every favor, every debt of gratitude, every weak point of her partner's was meticulously filed. They wanted to exclude her? Fine. Then she would exclude her influence, her name, her power, and they would discover in the hardest way possible that without her, there was nothing. The first call was to Michael, the owner of Taste and Elegance Catering. Her voice was calm, professional, devoid of any emotion that might betray the storm in her chest. "Michael, good afternoon. Victoria Hayes. I need an update on Ben and Madison's event. There's been a significant change in plans, and my personal involvement has been cancelled." On the other end, Michael's confusion was palpable. "Cancelled, Victoria, but everything's ready. The premium ingredients have already been ordered based on your guarantee." She interrupted him, her voice firm as steel. "I understand, Michael, and that's why I'm calling. All the courtesies, barters, and special discounts granted based on my involvement and the name of elite events need to be revoked. The contract must return to its full market value, effective immediately. Send the new invoice to the family. The contact is Patricia, the groom's mother." The silence on the other end was heavy. Michael was a businessman. He understood the message between the lines. This wasn't a commercial adjustment. It was an earthquake. "Victoria, that will triple the catering cost. They won't be able to pay." "That," Victoria replied, with a coldness that surprised her, "is a consequence they'll have to deal with. My company and my name can no longer be associated with an event from which I've been formally excluded. It's a matter of professional integrity." She hung up before he could argue, and the sensation of power that surged through her was dizzying. It was justice in its purest contractual form. The next call was to Elena from Bloom Designs Decor. The script was the same. Professional, direct, unrelenting. "Elena, about my brother-in-law's wedding. My participation has been vetoed. Therefore, the barter agreement we made is void. Please send the full quote to the family. Yes, the full amount. I appreciate your understanding." One by one, the calls were made. The photographer, the DJ, the manager of the Grand Pavilion, the valet service. Every piece of the puzzle she had masterfully assembled was methodically disassembled. Every discount, every courtesy, every favor was revoked. In less than an hour, the $100,000 castle of cards, which she had turned into a solid $40,000 foundation, became a castle of cards again, ready to collapse at the first breath of an invoice. The final blow, however, she reserved to deliver in person. She went downstairs and found Alexander in the living room, watching TV with a smug expression, as if he had solved a complex problem with great skill. He looked at her, perhaps expecting a tearful confrontation, a plea. Instead, he found the calm of a general after a successful maneuver. "Alexander," she said, her voice resonating in the room's silence, "just so there's no misunderstanding. Since I've been excluded from the wedding, I've informed all the suppliers that my name and that of Elite Events are no longer linked to the event. Consequently, all the benefits I secured have been cancelled." He stared at her, comprehension slow to dawn. What benefits? His question, so genuine in its ignorance, was the final proof of his contempt. He never knew, never cared to know. "The benefits, Alexander, that reduced the wedding cost from $100,000 to $40,000. The value is back to the original. I advise you to warn your mother to prepare for the new invoices." The color drained from Alexander's face. The remote fell from his hand. You didn't do that." "I did," she confirmed. "You removed me. I removed my support. It's simple, cause and consequence." And then she delivered the last blow, the one that would annihilate any remaining hope. "Oh, and by the way, that angel investor, the sponsorship your mother mentioned to Ben and Madison, it was me. And since I'm no longer part of the celebration, my $40,000 donation is, obviously, cancelled too." If a lightning bolt had struck inside the room, The effect couldn't have been more devastating. Alexander's face went through a succession of shock, denial, and finally, pure panic. He stood up, stammering, "Victoria, this is revenge. You're destroying my brother's dream over a whim." The accusation was so absurd, so detached from reality, that Victoria almost laughed. She stared at him, the queen in her power, and pronounced the final sentence with a firmness that sealed the fate of that wedding, and perhaps her own. "No, Alexander, it's not revenge. It's the direct result of your choices. You wanted to exclude me. You wanted to erase my presence. So now deal with the consequences of my complete absence. The dream, as you knew it, no longer exists because the dreamer was expelled." With that, she turned and went up the stairs, not to her bedroom, but to the guest room where she would spend the night. The sound from the living room wasn't of anger, but of pure desperation. The sound of Alexander on the phone, trying to explain the inexplicable to his mother. The symphony of chaos had begun, and Victoria, its composer, would hear every note with the somber satisfaction of justice being served. The silence that followed the storm was, in many ways, more deafening than the initial chaos. In the hours after her contractual declaration of war, Victoria took refuge in the guest room, an impersonal space that, paradoxically, felt more hers than the marital bedroom she had shared with Alexander for a decade and a half. She didn't feel triumph, not in the exultant sense of the word. What she felt was a cold and painful clarity, the lucidity of a surgeon who has just amputated a limb to save the body. The sound of Alexander's desperation, muffled by the walls, was the soundtrack to the ruin he himself had built. She could imagine the scene, Patricia, her mother-in-law, receiving the news not as a consequence, but as a personal attack, an affront from the daughter-in-law she had always considered arrogant and distant. She could visualize Ben and Madison, the engaged couple, being yanked from their bubble of happiness and thrown into a financial nightmare with no escape. Empathy, a trait so intrinsic to Victoria, struggled to surface, but was suffocated by the vivid memory of the humiliation, her husband's calculated coldness, an entire family's silent complicity. It didn't take long for the siege to begin. The first to call was Ben. Victoria looked at her cell phone screen, her brother-in-law's name glowing like a warning. She hesitated. Part of her, the part that still remembered the idealistic young man she had helped with career advice, wanted to answer. But the Victoria now in command knew any conversation would be an attempt at emotional manipulation. She declined the call, and again, and again. Then came the messages, a torrent of pleas and accusations. "Victoria, for God's sake, answer. What's going on? Mum said you cancelled everything. This can't be true. You're destroying our dream, Victoria. Why?" The question why made her scoff. Did they really not know? Or did they refuse to connect the dots, to admit that excluding one person could have a real cost? The avalanche of messages was interrupted by a call she knew she couldn't ignore forever. It was Madison, the bride, the young woman whose dreamy eyes had motivated her generous act in the first place. Victoria took a deep breath, prepared her emotional armor, and answered, putting the phone on speaker over the bed. The voice on the other end wasn't that of the excited young woman talking about flower arrangements. It was the voice of someone drowning. "Victoria, please listen to me." Sobs cut through her words, making them almost unintelligible. "I don't know what happened between you and Alexander. I swear I don't know the detail, but the wedding... Victoria, it's not going to happen anymore. It's over. The grand pavilion called, the catering, all of them. The amounts are impossible. We don't have that money. We don't even have a tenth of it." Victoria remained silent, forcing herself to be a rock against the tide of despair. She needed to hear, needed to understand how far their blindness went. "Madison," Victoria said, her voice controlled. "I'm sorry your dream has been interrupted, but the decisions that led to this weren't mine." "But you were the one who cancelled," Madison accused, her voice rising an octave, mixing plea and anger. "Michael from catering said it was your order. Why would you do this to us? What did we do to you?" "You didn't do anything to me, Madison. You just agreed to my exclusion. You accepted that I be erased from the celebration. You thought my presence was a problem, but that my money and influence weren't. You can't have one without the other. The silence on the other end was proof that the truth had hit her. Madison probably hadn't thought in those terms. For her, as for the rest of the family, Victoria was a divided entity, the problematic sister-in-law and the source of unlimited resources. They never saw her as a single person. It was then that Madison's humiliation reached its peak. Her voice returned low, broken, stripped of any pride. Please, Victoria, and I beg you, it doesn't have to be everything, but don't take it all. The wedding won't happen without you, at least the catering. Michael said he already bought the ingredients, that he'll take a huge loss. Think of him, think of us, anything. A little dignity is all I ask. The mention of Michael and his loss was the turning point. Victoria was, above all, a fair businesswoman. She knew her decision, while justified toward the family, splashed onto loyal partners. Michael, in particular, was a friend, a man who had trusted her blindly. Hurting him to hit the others seemed like a bitter victory, one that would leave a bad taste in her mouth. She found herself at a crossroads. Maintain her full position of strength, letting everyone bear the full consequences, or yield a millimeter, not for them, but for her own principles and for a friend. She reflected for a long moment, the sound of Madison's gasping breath on the line. The decision she made wasn't forgiveness, but strategy and conscience. She would maintain her position of power, but use it to teach a lesson, not just to destroy. Madison, she said, her voice now laden with unquestionable authority, I'll think about the catering, for Michael, but it won't be a gift, and it won't come for free. There will be a condition, a very clear condition. Anything, Madison replied, hope returning to her voice like a breath of life. I'll accept anything. It's not just you who has to accept, it's your whole family. Alexander, your mother-in-law, Ben, you, all of you, for the catering contract to remain, with the original value I negotiated. I demand an apology, not to me in particular. A public apology during the wedding reception, if it comes to happen. All of you will have to acknowledge what you did. You'll have to admit that you excluded me, and that the event is only happening because of me. You'll have to swallow your pride in front of all your guests. The proposal was brutal. It was an exchange of humiliation. The private humiliation she suffered for the public humiliation they would have to endure. It was the only currency they understood. Appearances, what others think. Madison went mute for an instant, processing the harshness of the condition. It was a high price, one that would taint the perfect memory of her wedding forever. But the alternative was no wedding at all. We'll do it, she finally whispered, her voice resigned. I'll talk to them. We'll do it. Good, Victoria said. But that covers only the catering. The rest, the venue, the decor, the music, the photographer, is on you. The amount I was donating is cancelled. However, for the catering, so you don't have the excuse that you can't pay, I'll do the following. The $40,000 value will be paid, but not by me. It'll be a loan from Elite Events to you, no interest, but you'll pay me back every cent in 48 installments. The first due the month after the wedding. That way you'll have the service, Michael won't take a loss, and you'll learn, month by month, for 4 years, the value of the dream you almost threw away. The solution was diabolical in its perfection. She wasn't the villain who destroyed everything, nor the fool who forgave and footed the bill. She was the creditor, the banker, the woman who would hold them by a financial leash, a monthly reminder of their arrogance and dependence. She was giving them a rope not to hang themselves, but one she would hold firmly. Madison could only murmur an almost inaudible "thank you" before hanging up. Victoria knew the battle wasn't over, but the war had changed nature. It was no longer about destroying, but about rebuilding the terms of her relationship with that family and with her husband, on a basis where her value could never again be questioned or ignored. She stood and went to the window. The rain had stopped. In the sky, through the dark clouds, a timid ray of sun began to break through. It wasn't a happy ending. It was the start of a reckoning. The weeks that followed were a raw reality exercise for Alexander's family. The grandiose dream of a wedding, which for a brief and magical period seemed within reach, crumbled, giving way to a stripped-down, almost skeletal version of what had been planned. Victoria's decision to keep the catering under the condition of a loan and a public apology was the only lifeline in an ocean of cancelled contracts and impossible budgets. Ben and Madison, their faces marked by exhaustion and embarrassment, spent days and nights on the phone trying to patch together what remained. The Grand Pavilion was out of the question. The wedding was moved to a neighborhood club's banquet hall, a decent place but devoid of any glamour. Elena's lavish decor was replaced by modest arrangements made by a friend's aunt. The renowned photographer gave way to a communications student who charged a symbolic fee. Every choice was a stark reminder of what they had lost, an echo of the influence they had scorned. Victoria observed everything from a distance, a spectator in her own drama. She had moved permanently to the guest room, creating a physical and emotional boundary that Alexander didn't dare cross. He tried in the first nights, an approach mixing anger and plea. He accused her of being vindictive and out of control, of humiliating his family out of spite. When anger didn't work, he appealed to their history. 15 years, Victoria, you're going to throw it all away over a misunderstanding? But it wasn't a misunderstanding, and they both knew it. It was a revelation. Every word from him only reinforced her certainty that he didn't see the depth of his betrayal. He saw only the inconvenience of the consequences. He didn't regret hurting her. He regretted getting caught and losing control of the situation. The woman he saw now wasn't the compliant wife he could manipulate, but a force of nature he didn't know how to contain. On the wedding day, a bittersweet atmosphere hung in the air. Victoria dressed with deliberate care, choosing a navy silk dress, elegant and understated. Her presence at the event wasn't that of a guest, but of a creditor, a witness to the condition she had imposed. Upon arriving at the hall, she felt the stares of all the relatives. There were no more forced smiles or protocol greetings. There was a mix of resentment, fear, and a newfound respect. She was the elephant in the room, the embodiment of the power they had underestimated. She greeted everyone with a polite nod and sat at a table in the back alone, a queen in her self-imposed exile. The ceremony was simple, almost rushed. Madison looked beautiful, but her eyes carried a shadow of sadness that the veil couldn't hide. Ben seemed like a man fulfilling a duty, the groom's joy replaced by the tension of someone who knows the hardest part is yet to come. During the reception, Michael's catering was the only spark of the original splendor. The dishes were impeccable, a stark contrast to the simplicity of the rest of the party, and it was during dinner, before the cake cutting, that the moment of truth arrived. The microphone was handed to Ben. The hall fell silent, the guests oblivious to the drama, sensing the shift in atmosphere. Ben, with trembling hands holding the microphone, looked at the small crowd, and then his eyes found Victoria's in the back of the hall. He took a deep breath, a man about to pay a debt of honor. "Good evening, everyone. Before we continue this celebration, my wife Madison and my entire family need to make an acknowledgement, an apology." A murmur ran through the guests. "Many of you know we dreamed of a big day, and if we're here today celebrating our union, even if in a simpler way, it's because of one single person, my sister-in-law, Victoria." He paused, swallowing hard. "We, in our arrogance and selfishness, made a terrible mistake. We treated her with a disrespect that borders on the unbelievable. We excluded her, believing we could benefit from her generosity without honoring her presence. And we were wrong, terribly wrong." He turned directly to Victoria, his voice choked. "Victoria, in front of everyone we love, I ask for your forgiveness. Forgiveness for our ingratitude, for our blindness. What you did for us was an act of love, and we responded with betrayal. This party, this dinner only exist because even after everything, you had the greatness not to let us sink completely. Thank you, and forgive me." Madison, at his side, also took the microphone, tears streaming freely. "What Ben said is the purest truth. I ask for forgiveness, Victoria. You gave us a dream and we turned it into a nightmare for you. I hope one day we can deserve the compassion you showed us." The silence that followed was heavy, laden with the gravity of the confession. The guests applauded, a confused applause, but one that recognized the courage of the act. Victoria merely nodded once, a gesture that didn't mean forgiveness, but receipt of the debt. The condition had been met. Despite the public reconciliation with part of the family, The abyss between her and Alexander was insurmountable. He watched the scene with an impassive face, a mask of humiliation and contained anger. Later, he approached her near the exit, away from curious eyes. "Satisfied? You got what you wanted. You humiliated all of us." Victoria looked at him, not with anger, but with a deep sadness, the sadness of looking at a stranger she once loved. "I didn't want to humiliate anyone, Alexander. I wanted you to understand, but I see you still haven't understood anything." She stepped closer, her voice low, just for him to hear. "You didn't betray me just as a wife, cheating with another woman. That, perhaps with time, I could try to understand. But you betrayed me as a woman. You used my strength, my work, my money to diminish me, to erase me, to turn me into nothing. You tried to break my spirit, and that, Alexander, has no forgiveness." She removed the white gold wedding band from her finger, the metal cold against her skin. "Our marriage is over. Not today. It ended the day you decided I was disposable." She placed the ring in his palm and closed his fingers over it. "Goodbye, Alexander." She turned and walked to the exit without looking back. The sound of the party music seemed to come from another world, a world she no longer belonged to. As she passed through the door, she felt a presence at her side. It was Michael, the catering owner. He said nothing, just accompanied her silently to the parking lot. When she reached her car, he finally spoke, his voice gentle and full of a respect she hadn't felt in a long time. "What you did today in there, it took a strength few people have. I've always admired you as a professional, Victoria. Today I started admiring you as a human being." Victoria felt a knot form in her throat, but it wasn't from sadness. It was from gratitude. On that dark night, in that empty parking lot, a small light of genuine recognition shone for her. It was the end of a painful chapter, but perhaps, just perhaps, the beginning of something new. The night was cold, but the air Victoria breathed in the silent parking lot seemed purer than any that had ever filled her lungs. Michael's words, simple and sincere, lingered between them, an unexpected balm for a wound she had barely begun to understand. "What you did today in there, it took a strength few people have. I've always admired you as a professional, Victoria. Today I started admiring you as a human being." She turned to him, the faint light from the street lamp illuminating the face of a man who, until that moment, had been just a reliable business partner. But now, in his eyes, she didn't see just a supplier. She saw an ally. Someone who, from his privileged position behind the scenes of the event, had understood the full drama, the injustice and the strength needed to correct it. A knot formed in her throat, but for the first time in weeks, it wasn't from anguish or anger. It was the harbinger of an emotion she had almost forgotten, gratitude for being seen. "Thank you, Michael," she managed to say, her voice a bit hoarse. "Your words mean more than you know." He smiled, a gentle smile that softened the features of his face, marked by years of hard work in the kitchen. "I saw what they tried to do. And I saw how you turned the poison into medicine. Not medicine for them, but for yourself. That's rare." He didn't try to console her or offer empty advice. He just witnessed her strength and validated it. In that moment, Victoria realized the depth of the loneliness she had lived in during the last years of her marriage. She was surrounded by a family that saw her as a resource and a husband who saw her success as a veiled threat. Michael, in a few minutes, offered her a level of understanding that Alexander hadn't been able to give in 15 years. He walked her to her car door, a gesture of silent chivalry. Before she got in, he touched her arm lightly, a brief contact, but laden with respect. "You deserve someone who sees your strength and your heart every day, Victoria, not just when it's convenient." With a final nod, he walked away, leaving her with those words echoing in her mind. She got in the car and sat there for a long moment, watching him go. That encounter wasn't a flirtation, wasn't the start of a romance, but it was something perhaps more important. It was the first crack in the ice wall that had formed around her heart. It was proof that there were men capable of admiring a strong woman without feeling diminished by her. Alexander's separation was less a battle and more a surrender. He who initially ranted and threatened seemed to wilt when he realized Victoria's decision was irrevocable. The woman he had tried to humiliate was the same one who signed the checks that maintained his lifestyle. Without her, he was just the heir to a mid-sized import company, with a lifestyle he could no longer sustain. The divorce was quick and clinical. Victoria was generous, but not foolish. She gave him what was his by right, but cut all financial ties linking him to the elite events empire. Alexander, embittered, found himself free to pursue his new dynamic with Harper, the bride's cousin, but discovered that the shine of conquest fades quickly when there's no longer the power and prestige of a wife like Victoria to sustain the fantasy. He rued the loss, not just of the woman but of the status she provided, a late and painful lesson about the true value of what he never knew to appreciate. For Victoria, the following months were of rediscovery. Living alone for the first time in over a decade was initially scary. The house's silence was a constant companion, but gradually she began to fill that silence not with noise, but with her own essence. She returned to painting, a hobby she had abandoned for lack of time. She started taking long walks in the city's parks, not to exercise the body but to calm the mind. She rekindled friendships neglected amid the marriage routine. She discovered that solitude wasn't a void, but a space to be herself, without filters, without the need to adapt to anyone's expectations. Her relationship with Alexander's family found a new and strange balance. Ben and Madison, bound to her by the monthly loan, were respectful and distant. The debt was a constant reminder of their failure, but also of the grace granted to them. Victoria, in turn, treated them with professional cordiality, receiving the payments without comment, a silent creditor teaching them, with every bill, a lesson about responsibility. The relationship would never be warm again, but there was in it a base of forced respect that was, in a way, more honest than the false intimacy of before. And Michael? He reappeared in her life a few weeks after the wedding, under the pretext of discussing a new contract. The business meeting quickly turned into a long and pleasant conversation about life, dreams, and the scars we all carry. He was a divorced man, father of a teenage daughter, someone who also knew the pain of loss and the strength of rebuilding. They discovered affinities that went far beyond the event world. They shared a love for gastronomy, an ironic sense of humor, and most importantly, a deep respect for each other's work and integrity. Their first unofficial date was his invitation to check out a small Italian restaurant that had just opened. The night was light, full of laughter. With Michael, Victoria didn't need to be the owner of elite events or the betrayed ex-wife. She could just be Victoria. He listened to her stories with genuine interest, celebrated her achievements without a hint of envy, and spoke of his own vulnerabilities with disarming honesty. He wasn't intimidated by her success. He admired it. He didn't see her strength as a threat. He saw it as part of who she was. Their relationship blossomed slowly, like a complex recipe requiring time and patience. It was built on the solid foundation of friendship and mutual respect. The first kiss happened months later, on a rainy night, after a dinner where she caught herself thinking she hadn't felt so happy and at peace in years. It was a kiss without the fire of teenage passion, but with the comforting warmth of a safe harbor. It was an adult love, one that didn't seek to complete the other, but to walk alongside, in partnership. With Michael, Victoria learned that true love doesn't erase who you are. It shines a light on your best version. He loved her for her strength, her intelligence, her generosity, and even for the toughness she had been forced to learn. He loved the whole woman, with all her layers. A year after the fateful wedding, Victoria was in her new apartment, a bright space with a park view which she had decorated exactly to her taste. Michael was in the kitchen preparing dinner, the sound of his laughter mixing with the sizzle of the pan. Her cell phone buzzed. It was a bank notification, the payment of the 12th installment of Ben and Madison's loan, a reminder of a past that no longer hurt. It was just a fact, a scar telling the story of how she broke and remade herself, stronger and more whole than before. She looked at Michael, who was calling her to taste the sauce, and smiled, a genuine smile from the depths of her soul. She had lost a marriage but gained herself, and in the process found a love that didn't require her to be smaller so he could feel bigger, a love that celebrated the queen she had always been. And so ends Victoria's journey. A story about the power that resides in us, often dormant, waiting for the right moment to awaken. A story that reminds us that respect isn't a favor. It's the foundation of any relationship. I hope you've connected with Victoria's strength as much as I have. May her path inspire us to never ever accept less than we deserve. Now, I'd love to hear your thoughts. What did you think of this story? What was the moment that marked you the most?
And that wraps up today's story. Now we want to hear from you. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments, and let's see how far these stories reach. If this story moved you or gave you chills, give it a like, share, and subscribe for more powerful stories. One last thing, rate the story from 1 to 10 in the comments. Your feedback helps us bring you even better ones next time. Thanks for watching. We appreciate you being part of this storytelling journey.